what I'm going to do, a little bit like Richard, is show you a trailer from the film that was based on my book, and it's called Icebreaker, the 72 Summit Series. You can get it on DVD in French and English. It's shown on Super Channel. It's on WestJet flights. And if you're taking a cruise across the Atlantic on Cunard lines, you can see it there as well. Okay, so Don, please.
There's no question.
Hockey is in our DNA.
We're the collective good soldiers, except when we step on the ice. Then we're the warrior. 72 series. Example.
People all over the world see this game in television in the Soviet Union, all over Europe, Canada, the United States.
72 series was one of the greatest thrills in hockey history.
It was the first time that we had the best players of Canada playing against the Russians.
It was the Cold War.
Le contexte géopolitique de cette époque-là, il était inquiétant.
The one difference in the equation was Pierre Trudeau. His goal was détente, reduce political tensions, use hockey. It was going to be best on best.
4 games in Canada, 4 in Russia. I thought we went 8-3, handily.
Esposito scored in 30 seconds, and we thought, this is all over.
Then the pendulum started to swing the other way.
They're beating us. This couldn't happen.
This is war. By the end of that first game, hockey in the world changed forever.
It was an eye opener that other people other than Canadians play the game.
We learned the lesson that there's no entitlement.
Canada was exposed, and the NHL was exposed. Is this communism at work here? Is that what's making this game so cohesive?
Là, cette série-là, ça devient vraiment le combat entre l'Ouest et l'Est.
Such an iconic moment, it's such a historic moment. It's a part of the Canadian curriculum.
Понимаю каждый год уходящий, чтобы сделали историю.
Hockey is our game. Hockey is Russia's game. And it really gets to the people. It gets to the fans.
It's 50 years and I still get goosebumps.
You need to understand what 72 was. You need to know the history, the month, the lead up, the drama. Everything that was engraved.
It was the Cold War at that time. But for a 4-week period, everyone put down their weapons and said, hey, we're going to have this battle on the ice. We're going to shake hands when it's over. That was a great example for people in Canada and people in the Soviet Union. 72 series was an icebreaker for a lot of reasons. It was the greatest hockey that was ever played.
Okay, so Gretzky said the greatest hockey ever played. Was he right? Team Canada was chosen as the team of the 20th century in Canada. Henderson's goal with 34 seconds left, his third winning goal in 3 games. He scored the last Canadian goal in game 5 and the last Canadian goal in game 3. CBC Sports in 2017, looking back at 150 years of Canadian history, said it was the greatest moment in Canadian sports history. Everything else is not even close. All right, so sports. The Dominion Institute of Canada in 1999 did a major survey of Canadians, asking them to list the greatest events, not sports events, the greatest events in Canadian history. So Medicare, Vimy Ridge, women's suffrage, D-Day, the creation of the Constitution, the flag. The 1972 Summit Series is listed in that top 10. It was a seminal event, coast to coast to coast. First time that the maple leaf was taken abroad. You know, there's a lot of controversy with the red ensign when it came in the 60s. A lot of the military were against it, saying we fought under the ensign. It was the first time when the fans went to Moscow with that maple leaf and the players with a sunburst maple leaf on their jersey. National unity. When this was over, the streets were filled with Canadians of a kind nobody had seen since the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. Schools came together. There were TVs in schools for the first time. Kids came into auditoriums and classrooms and sat and watched this series from Moscow. Business ground to a halt. 16 out of 22 million Canadians watched this series on radio or television. We in the embassy in Moscow estimated that 150 million Soviets watched this on Soviet television. They really didn't have much else to watch except for propaganda. They love sports, but this was going to be best on best. They were fascinated by it. So Richard mentioned the history, 1920, the Winnipeg Falcons, a bunch of Icelandic Canadians win the first Olympic medals, and it was in the summer. We win in 24, 28, 32. 1936, Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, Nazi Germany. We don't win. We beat the Nazis. They had a Jewish player, by the way. And the only reason they did was because the team captain said he wouldn't play if the Jewish player, I think his name was Rudolf Ball, if he didn't play. So we beat the Nazi Germany team, but we lost to Great Britain. And who was involved in that team? Yeah, lots of Canadians, people who studied in Canada in the military, but the general manager of that team was a guy called Bunny Ahern, who later took over the IIHF, the International Ice Hockey Federation, and became a real thorn in our side. So we roll along. 1952, Edmonton Mercury's last time we won the Olympics. 1961, Trail Smoke Eaters, last time we won the World Championships. Lose, lose, lose. Change format with Father David Bauer. Lose, lose, lose. So we go forward to 1968, Pierre Trudeau's election. He said that, well, he pushed, first of all, to get Vancouver into the NHL. But he also said that sports is part of culture. Culture is part of national identity. National identity is part of national unity. You may recall national unity was a big issue for Canada at the time. Sports and politics coming together. He creates Hockey Canada in February 1969, and his prime goal was to get us back up on the podium, start to win hockey again, because our reputation was dependent on it. You know, it was said that Canada wasn't good at a lot of things, but we were good at hockey. And so our pride was at stake here. So the second element of all this is the politics. Pierre Trudeau was a bit of a radical, you might say. He didn't like convention. He thought that we needed more breathing room from the United States. Sound familiar? Yeah. So he goes to China, opens diplomatic relations with China in 1970. And in May of 1971, he decides to go to the Soviet Union. We had had a lot of trouble with the Soviets, Cuban Missile Crisis, problems in Berlin, invasion of Czechoslovakia in 68. He said, we've got to make sure we don't have a nuclear war. He was very concerned that some guy, some general somewhere was going to press a button, or that technology would kick in and start missile launch. So he said, I need to go and speak to the enemy. So he and Margaret Trudeau, they were just married in March of 1971. May 71, they go to Moscow, and then all around the country, 12 days. And he signs a protocol on consultation. Americans weren't too happy with that. Thought we were cozying up to the communists. In October of that year, Soviet Premier Kosygin comes back to Canada. Very, very quick return. And he's met by protests everywhere. Montreal, Ottawa, windows are broken. 3,000 people get up on Parliament Hill. There are Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Baltics, Jewish Canadians who were concerned about policy in Russia forbidding emigration to Israel at the time. Goes to Toronto, Edmonton, demonstrations, and in Ottawa, by the way, a Hungarian Canadian jumped on his back and, in the words of a journalist, rode him like a horse before the RCMP pulled him off. So he gets to Vancouver, and we have penciled in a hockey game. Montreal Canadiens against the Vancouver Canucks. He's lying on his bed. I don't want to go. I don't want to be booed one more time, particularly not by 15,000 people. Paul Martin Sr., who was his escort officer, says, I think it might be a little different. And it was. For the first time ever, the Soviet flag flew in an NHL arena. He goes down to center ice. Henri Richard is there, captain of the Canadiens. Orland Kurtenbach for the Canucks. He gives them a tie clip, remember those? Cufflinks, and they give him hockey sticks. And he suggests, why aren't we playing hockey anymore? Because we had pulled out of international hockey in 1970. So a couple of weeks later, I was involved in signing a general exchanges agreement with the Soviet Union. Not just scientists or educators, researchers, ballerinas, artists, but sports people. And that agreement at the top between the two leaders set the stage for us to negotiate an agreement. Because as we know, the sticking point on it all was the issue of amateurism. Some reason they were called amateurs and we weren't. So we had to get around that. And we got around it by having agreement that we would play an exhibition series called Druzhba in Russian. Exhibition series. And Tarasov, before he was fired, in the fall of 1971, he laid out an idea of 4 games in each country. Very unusual because, 7 games for Stanley Cup. 4 in Canada, 4 in the Soviet Union under IIHF rules. And Americans would referee in Canada, and West Europeans would referee the Soviet Union. And originally there were going to be 4 locations in the Soviet Union, not just Moscow, but Leningrad, Kiev, and Sverdlovsk, I think it was. And as we know, the Canadian itinerary, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver. Argue, okay. The principle is exhibition so that your amateur status is not jeopardized. And that's how when I was talking to the Russians, Sports Committee and the Soviet Ice Hockey Federation, that was key. And it was going to be agreement best on best. And this agreement was signed then at the World Hockey Championships in Prague in April 1972. And it was signed by Joe Krushka, the president of the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association. Al Eagleson was not there. Hockey Canada people were. The Russians didn't want to deal with them. That's why in the slide that we saw with Hockey Canada that Henderson was holding up, no Hockey Canada. The Soviets insisted that they had to deal with an amateur association, and their partner was the CAHA. Amateur versus amateur, protect their status. We agreed in September because the Canadians weren't playing. The Russians, turns out, wanted September, not because they were in great shape, but because the Munich Olympics were on at the same time. And they had told me and a few others that they didn't expect to win the hockey series. They thought maybe 2 games, but they wanted to bury the press coverage of this underneath their victories in Munich, because they beat the Americans in basketball and they were expected to lead the medal count. Because the Soviet ideologist, Mikhail Suslov, said, we've got to show that Soviet man is better than capitalist man. And the way you demonstrate that is through the number of gold and silver medals you win. So we get the agreement. Part of the agreement was that there would be an exchange of coaches. It wasn't going to be a blind series. It was going to be an exchange of coaches. They sent 2 coaches over for 15 days to Maple Leaf Gardens, where Team Canada's practices were being held. And they were there day and afternoon and night, watching every practice Team Canada and taking great notes. On the other hand, we sent 2 Leafs over to Russia. Somehow they ended up going to Leningrad to watch some league play. They came to Moscow. They were going to go back home to Canada. I said, well, look, you haven't even seen the Soviet national team playing. You got to stay over. They asked me, said, all right, you got to call our wife and tell them that we're going to be another day late and so on. So we went to the game. It was an inter-squad game of the Nationals. Krejciak was getting married the next day. He let in 8 goals. And they drew the conclusion that he was a civ. That there was no way that they were going to beat them. And I think that led in to the feeling of overconfidence. And the fact that Canadians weren't ready to play. The Stanley Cup was over in May at the time. And the players didn't get paid a lot of money. They went around and sold beer, often representing, Molson's and so on. Sold used cars, sold new cars, stood around and signed autographs and so on. Training camp was intended to get them back into shape. The Soviets, 11 months. Practice, running, dry land. We didn't do any of that. Diet. All of a sudden, diet became a big issue. And you think, well, today, we know that. That's pretty standard, right? For an athlete, you got to train, you got to train, you got to train, you got to eat properly. No drinking beer, no smoking. Soviets do that. So we're set. And first game's going to be in Montreal. And it was decided I was going to be their escort officer because I spoke Russian. My job was dealing with exchanges. And I played left defense for the Moscow Maple Leafs, the only Canadian team playing the Soviets at that time. We had a team made up of Finns and Swedes, Canadians, and an American goalie. 36 people on the aircraft, 35 Russians, and myself. The only thing they knew about professionals was they knew about Bobby Hull, because his book, Hockey My Game, had been translated into Russian. And Bob Roth, the Soviet coach, had a forward to it. So they would say, well, who else is playing? Gordie Howe? No. Why isn't Bobby Hull playing? Well, because he's joined the WHA. Well, what's that got to do with it? In the Soviet Union, if they say we're playing, we're playing. Government says that we're playing. They said, well, you've got the NHL and WHA that we're agreeing. And the terms and conditions on the Canadian side was, if you didn't have an NHL contract by August the 13th, 1972, you didn't play for Team Canada. So we lost Bobby Hull, J.C. Tremblay, Cheevers, Derek Sanderson, and a number of others. And despite the fact that Pierre Trudeau got involved in it, because a lot of Canadians say, what the hell? This is supposed to be best on best. Bobby Hull's one of the best. He's got to be on the team. But capitalism reigned supreme. Campbell and Hockey Canada said, no, we had this deal. He can't play. So we land in Montreal, and the first thing that happens, because you always know that things aren't going to go according to plan. Some guy, a Canadian, had been in Prague in 1968 and rented a car, and a Soviet tank ran over it. And he was asked to pay $1,500 in compensation. So he launched a lawsuit in Quebec to seize the Soviets' equipment. And the Soviet ambassador said, if this happens, we're turning around and we're going back to Moscow. Series all over. So we got that straightened out. Hot day in Montreal. The time of Fahrenheit, 80 degrees and so on. Place is packed. There's lots of lights. Harry Sinden decides to go with 12 forwards and 5 defensemen. Going to be a turkey shoot. Peter Movavi would later tell me, what, Ken Dryden on one side and him there, he said, you know, Gary, the reason we lost game 1, Harry put out 12 forwards, 5 defensemen, and no goalie. So Ken didn't like that very much. But Ken didn't have a good record. He had played them before, as I mentioned, had let in 8 goals. He said he was in a zone. He doesn't remember what happened, but his style was to go out to meet the shooters coming down the wing. And when they crossed the blue line, they'd let a slap shot go. The Soviets, crisscross, pass. 3 passes for every Canadian pass. So stamina. And at one point after the second period, the Soviets are up 4-2. I saw Al Eagleson. He had come to Moscow for a run in July. And I said, Al, what's happening here? He said, you're a fucking commie just like they are. I said, no, Al, I'm on your side. He said, that's what I thought, you were on our side. Yeah. But he called, and Ferguson called out Honecker, who was doing the sidekick to Foster Hewitt. There was enormous pressure on these guys, enormous pressure. Sinden, Ferguson, and Eagleson were carrying the weight of this country on their shoulders. Everybody thought that we were going to win handily. We didn't, down 7-3. So we get to Toronto. This is Labor Day weekend. Pierre Trudeau, by the way, had called a national election on the 1st of September. He was at the game in Montreal, so was Robert Stanfield of Conservatives. Trudeau shows up in Toronto also. Sports is good economics and good business. It's also good politics. Sinden changes up the lineup. We win 4-1. Peter Mohavich's goal was, I thought, the goal of the series. We get to Winnipeg. Sinden keeps Esposito in goal because originally the plans were to change. And Sinden had promised every player, 35 players, that each and every one of them would have an opportunity to play one game, and that each of them would be able to take their wives or girlfriends to Moscow for a holiday. So we're up twice in Winnipeg. They come back. Kid line comes back, 20-year-old guys from the wings of the Soviet. Tie it up, 2-2, then 4-4. Game ends in a tie. And we go to Vancouver, 1-1-1, and we lay an egg in Vancouver. Bill Goldsworthy goes off twice for high sticking, hitting guys in the head. They score 2 similar goals from the blue line. We lose that game. People in Vancouver booed Team Canada off the ice. And then unbeknownst to me and a number of the players and certainly the Soviet players, Esposito gives the famous speech that we're not in this for money, we're in it because we love our country. Some people later said it was equivalent to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. or equivalent to Churchill's defiance speech, We'll fight them on the beaches and on the landing strips. So here's a sweaty Canadian hockey player being compared to Churchill and Lincoln. Because we love hockey. Hockey is part of our DNA, as was mentioned. So we then go to the Soviet Union. I think there were several reasons why the series changed. We had the Swedish interlude, dissension in the Canadian ranks. Up to 10 players were going to abandon ship because they hadn't played. But the Soviets got cocky too. They broke their training regime. They didn't go back to their camp. They started to go out to parties, cosmonauts and scientists and ballerinas and so on. Broke the regime, and then they were nervous in front of their leadership. And we were starting to gel, and Harry realized that he's going to have to collapse the size of it. 35 guys doesn't cut it. You've got to get down to the same 17, 18, 19 players. And when he did that, 4 players left the team out of Moscow. Don't need to mention their names. But we started to come together. Stapleton told me, look, we're feeling better. We're starting to figure out Soviet moves. Game 6, we get the famous two-hander by Bobby Clark on Harlamov's ankle. I thought at that point, we were going to have a riot, because we've got 2,700 Canadian fans coming over from Canada, 250 Canadians associated with the embassy, so roughly 3,000 there. After Game 5, that cheered on Team Canada with singing of "O Canada." Letters and postcards started to come in. Team was feeling better. And Game 5, one of the quintessential items from a political point of view happened when the introductions were being made. The young girls and guys that come out with carnations made introductions. Numero Sid Moy, number 7, Phil Esposito. Phil steps forward, goes onto a carnation, goes on his back, hits the ice, and splays his legs out like this. And he looks up, and there's Brezhnev. Look. And he does a wave, and he does bending of the arm. If any Soviet player had done that, it would have been an eastbound train to Siberia. So as I write in the book, I think that was where we showed the difference between collectivism, authoritarianism, and individualism and capitalism in that very instance. We come back, Henderson, as I say, we win 3-2. Then we win the next game 4-3. Esposito's in goal. Henderson scores a beauty. Goes around 2 forwards, 2 defensemen, and tripped and gets a shot off. And then game 8. And we spent hours and hours and hours arguing about referees. And Harry and Al Eagleson said, the series is off. If the West German referees come out, series is over, we're going home. And I had been told by head guy in Ottawa, look, Gary, your job here is to keep this series on the rails. So I made a proposal with 1 referee each pick 1. And we picked the Swede, Dahlberg, and we were dealing with 2 KGB agents, and one of them, I could see the smile creep on his face. And he said, well, that's fine, but Dahlberg is ill. And Al said, but I just had breakfast with Dahlberg. He's sitting at this table beside me. Well, he's ill now. Well, we knew it was a political illness. Anyway, we got to pick the Czechoslovakian referee Bada, and they got to follow the West German. And the game starts off, and we get 1 penalty, 2 penalties, and the 3rd penalty with JP Parise. That's the famous scene where he's going to 2-hand the referee and send off the game misconduct. Al and Harry and Ferguson throwing out benches and towels on the ice. And the crowd starts yelling out, we're going home, we're going home. After that, the West German put his whistle away. But we're still down 5-3. And by the way, I had, after game 5, I had been asked by Harry to take Phil Esposito to a Soviet hospital because he popped up blood. And he said, don't tell anyone, Gary. I said, what about the team doctor? No. What about other players? No. Certainly not the media. And tell any Russians? No. How am I going to do this? So we had invited the British Embassy doctor the night before, and I called him up and he said, made an arrangement. I got Phil in for x-rays, and Phil's a big guy and Phil's a hairy guy. And the x-ray machine was sort of like this. And she got like that. And he steps up and two little Russian nurses giggling away, takes off his chain. And the doctor comes out, said, no. Said, I don't see anything busted here, but you have an enormous chest cavity. And an enormous chest cavity means endurance. Phil had endurance. And they said they had seen the game the night before. And they wouldn't tell anybody about this incident. So we get to game 8, and the night before that, we had gone to the Bolshoi Theater to see Anna Karenina. And hockey players and ballet don't go together. Tony said, do we have to go, Phil? Yeah, we'll go for the first act. And after the first act, they got up and Phil started yelling out, bravo, bravo, bravo. And the ballerina looks out from the curtain and said, what's that out there? That's one of the Canadian hockey players. So game 8, we're down 5-3. Who shows up outside the dressing room? But the Soviet ballerina, Maya Protsetskaya. I want to speak to Phil. So he comes out of the dressing room. She goes up to him and said, you came out to see me last night perform the ballet. I'm here tonight to see you perform in hockey. Some people said he became Hercules on ice in the third period. He had a goal and 2 assists. When it was all over, the Soviet cultural community said that the reason the Soviet team lost was because the ballerina had gone and inspired Phil. So there was afterwards monitoring the press, Soviet press. It was all about hooligans, the roughing up of Harlamov, pushing and shoving, still going like this. Went on for months and months until we got to January, and finally some of the Soviet hockey journalists started to talk about the skill of Canada, and particularly how Phil was able to get in the slot and not be moved out of it. Scored his goals from the slot, whereas the Soviet players would skate through the slot and keep on going. They didn't want the rough stuff. So they said they're going to have to change their ways. So they learned, but we also learned. We had 98% of NHL hockey players at the time were Canadian. Today we're down to about 43%. The internationalization of the game started at that point, you know, Salming and company. Swedes and Finns and Czechs and Slovaks and Germans and Russians, Slovenians, Swiss. So the game has really changed at that time. The whole issue of diet and training. And for some time, we were able to improve relations with the Soviets. Now, I don't have time to talk about the KGB, but I had to deal with them a lot. They were after me a lot because I was a NATO diplomat. I spoke Russian. There were bugs all over the place. They threw beautiful women at me and so on and so forth. But nice, yeah. We had a bug in our bedroom. My wife said, don't worry about it. They might learn something new. Yeah, and that was the only way to deal with all that stuff was sense of humor, because the government in Ottawa said, you look, if you're going to have a fight with your wife, take it out into the parking lot. Well, who does that? Right? Are you going to get your hat and coat and boots on and hold everything until you get out in the parking lot and then let at it? No. So the KGB, when the Canadian fans came over, they weren't worried about drunkenness. We had estimated 36 would be arrested. Only one was, Kerpluff, for busting up a bar and assaulting a KGB officer. He was going to get 1 to 5 years of hard labor in Siberia. We got him off, kept the others out of jail, but they were concerned about Canadians of Ukrainian background and Balts who were going to stir up trouble. They're also worried about Canadians' fierce extraction who would stir up the Jewish community there. So that's who they were watching out for. And eventually, in the mid-70s, the issue of Ukraine, lots of pressure in Canada, just as today, started to destabilize the relationship. And then when the Soviets went into Afghanistan in December of 1979, there was a rupture, and then we got into the boycotting of the Olympics in Moscow, 1980, the counter boycott in Los Angeles, 1984. But we still have, at least I thought, and I believe it, that hockey is still a bridge. How do you deal with authoritarian governments? You don't just, get your weapons ready and stop talking. You've got to keep communicating. And you need to use all the linkages you can. So we've got, Russian hockey players still in the NHL, still got Canadians going over to Russia to play. And I just heard from Dennis that apparently some of them have accepted Russian passports so that they're not counted as imports. So that's an interesting thing. So there's lots of politics involved. Sports doesn't exist on its own. We know that Olympics are used for bragging rights. Doping gets involved, a lot of chest thumping, but you've got to work both together. And I found myself doing that in 1972. So I'll just show you a couple of slides. What do we got here? Why don't you let's start. Okay, so we've seen tickets now. What do you know about this? This is Maple Leaf Gardens. I had tickets for all 8 games. I gave 7 sets to the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto and 1 set Canadian Museum of History. What strikes you about this? Yeah, ticket price $7. There was a national lottery, so the season ticket holders got first crack, and then the rest were up for a lottery. 350,000 Canadians applied for tickets. And you got 2 tickets for $15. There was a $1 min fee. Now that's me in Moscow driving a Mustang and long hair. This is the first day coming from Finland. Within the first day, my gas cap was stolen and my side mirrors were stolen. Anything that had a Mustang on it, stolen. And a little while later, so why would someone steal my side mirrors? In the ballet, a woman next to me opened her purse and brought out a side mirror, because there were no cosmetic mirrors at the time. It was a tough go for. Here's a picture of my license. It was done in French, but this thing here, you got gas. They kept control of how much gas you were using, because you couldn't go outside the center of the city, 40 kilometers outside, without permission in advance, 48 hours in advance. So as a backup, they would check that. There I am with my wife. Diplomacy, a lot has got to do with hospitality. I had Sinden and Ferguson and Bobroff and Eagleson over for a meal at the time. There's Margaret and Pierre Trudeau, welcomed by my wife and myself in Moscow, May 71. There's Trudeau at the Canadian Embassy. Yeah, so I mentioned traveling with the Soviet team. So it says I'm USSR hockey team. In addition to all training camps, all Canada games, all Soviet teams. And that let me go around arena, into the dressing rooms. So even though I had tickets, I was able to circle around. And particularly in Moscow, where we had so much trouble, bench issues and so on, I stood beside the Canadian bench or between the Canadian bench and the dressing room to talk to the Soviets. And when Al and Harry and Ferguson came to Moscow for a dry run in July of '72, there's Aggie Kukovitz, who was a Russian speaker, later became very proficient in Canada Cup Series and so on, great guy. He was captain of the Moscow Maple Leafs. The various Russians, including Bobrov, the coach on the far right. So that's our discussions in Moscow. One of the things we had to decide upon was uniforms, because both our national colors are red and white. Who's going to wear red in which country? And this was the first time also we were called Team Canada, right? From then till today, we have Team Canada, this, that, and the other thing. So the way we got around the red and white issue also was that we decided to wear black pants. And that, again, is the first time we started wearing black as part of our national colors. And Harry said, when you're on the ice and you're sort of looking sideways, you need to know, is it foe or teammate? And so black pants means yes. Okay, and I'm just showing you in the discussions some of the uniforms there, who's going to play. This guy is head of the Soviet Ice Hockey Federation. There's Eagleson in the back. And we're discussing some of these details. They had a propaganda department. There's a propaganda guy, and this is the snowman who organized the Izvestia tournaments. We were part of the Izvestia tournaments, and he was losing money on Izvestia tournaments. He said, we need to get the Canadians back to the Izvestia tournaments because the fans are interested in Canada Soviet Union. Gainers Al in the background. Yeah. All right, so what's this here? The bench, right? That's the penalty bench. No penalty box. That's Dennis Hull. And let's go back there. So here are the Soviet militia. You remember the encounter with Eagleson. So they're 2 deep all around the arena. And where are they looking? Not at the ice. They're looking up in the stands, and particularly at those 3,000 Canadian fans. Yeah. I had a lot of stuff, particularly when Gilbert Perrault and the others left the team. I got their equipment. I wore it with the Moscow Maple Leafs, and then turned it over to the Hockey Hall of Fame. So Ron Ellis, no longer with us, Henderson cuffing me, Rod Sealy, and Kenny Dryden. Sean, do you want to say a word? Because this is hockey sticks. Yeah.
So, by pure circumstance, my father, Gary, went to university together in the 60s. Well, I'd heard rumors that Gary was involved in the 1972 series. So, I was born almost a year exactly the day that the series ended. I had a big interest in it growing up as a child. Went to university, studied history with Andrew and Mike, among others. And in 1997, I did a museum exhibit at Goderich at the Huron County Museum on the history of hockey in that county. By pure circumstance, Lucknow is located on the very northern border of that county. And does anybody know who grew up in Lucknow? There you go. So at the end of that exhibit, they said you can keep one item from the show. What would you like to keep? And it was this picture right here. So for 25 years, this sat first in my bedroom, later where it lives now in my living room, with a frame made by my father of some of the hundreds of hockey sticks my brothers and I had broken over the years. So when Gary finally decided to write the book, it was pure kismet that he happened to already know somebody who knew how to do work in the archives and was fairly familiar with the series. Oh, Andrew, look away. You're not allowed to take photos in the archives unless you have signed paperwork that you're taking pictures of the images. Exactly, it's a green sheet. Anyway, so I made arrangements for Gary to go in, and we pulled several hundred boxes of records. Gary spent a few days saying, yeah, this looks good, that looks good, whatever. I got to get writing, have at her. So we must have, you eventually went through tens of thousands of pages that I had taken images of and called through out of the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association funds, out of the Team Canada funds, out of the external affairs collections, amongst others at Library and Archives Canada. So Gary's book and the subsequent documentary was years in the making. For the documentary itself and the book, Gary had asked me to find a handful of representative photographs. And me being like a kid in the candy store, Gary and Robbie Hart, who was the director of the documentary, had made arrangements to have access and to reproduce the Frank Lennon collection. And Frank Lennon was a photojournalist for the Toronto Star,
who was at the games in Canada, but he had the copyright for all of the photos overseas. He was with Team Canada in Moscow, and his records ended up in Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. So during the course of COVID, I made several calls and pleaded and was able to get special arrangements to go in and look at these fonts and pull some representative records. So again, Gary came one day, said, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z. We, of course, ran out of time because there are literally thousands of photographs in this collection. So almost on a weekly basis for almost a year, I would be back in the archives filing through the documents, not only looking for the action shots, of course, that everybody loves, but representative shots of the Canadian experience in Moscow. So in this document in the foreground, you see, of course, the famous Phil Esposito, but to his right, walking toward the camera with a tie on, his hands in his pocket, the long hair, is our Gary Smith you see before you as a man about town. And this is the third in a series of records, or of images from this. The first two are Gary running across the courtyard, obviously to cut somebody off from something they weren't supposed to be doing. And also photos like this. So this is Gary checking everybody into the hotel. You'll see Bobby Clark is to his right. The very tall gentleman is, of course, Ken Dryden, kind of looking away from the camera. And Cornway is staring down some impatience by the look of it, toward the hotel staff. And then, of course, pictures like this. So Gary talked about all the Canadians who went there and supportive, super loud. So when Gary wasn't down in the bench or running around behind the scenes, keeping the Soviets and the Canadians happy, he was up in the stands, keeping an eye on the Canadians there. So Gary is smack in the middle of this photo. If you can identify a famous defenseman named Bobby Orr, to his right, you can just barely see the top of Ken Dryden's head. And then beside him is Serge Savard. And directly above them is Gary and half of his wife L'Oreal's face underneath the Canadian flag. So it was very interesting for me to see people I knew and heard of in these historic photos that hadn't been seen, if at all, in decades. And then, of course, this. So having had this photo on my wall from a museum exhibit, getting to hold the negative, well, daintily with gloves and whatnot, and then getting it reproduced. Gary's book is the first time it's been legally reproduced in a publication since the photograph was taken. And there's the book there. So if you'd like copies, they're on the table.
Just a couple of things. One, copyright and permission. You know, it's amazing how copyright exists and how much you have to pay to have permission to use film or somebody else's words, and tracking down who's got the ownership of photographs and paragraphs from somewhere else. That's one thing. Archives, essential. 50 years ago, I thought I had a pretty good recollection of what happened. But when you go and get the documents out, and some of them I had written myself from Moscow 50 years ago, because everything from the Canadian side, Hockey Canada, NHL Players Association, CAHA, went through the Department of External Affairs in Ottawa to the Canadian Embassy in Moscow. Then I could use it for the negotiations, and it went back. So when you get the archives out, you look at stuff and say, oh my God, I thought this was black, and it's white here in the document. And so you have to start to cross-reference a lot of stuff and footnotes. So it's invaluable that you have access to archives, and invaluable that you have somebody like Sean Stoyles who knows their way around the archives. And that picture with in the stands, those were the Black Aces, right? Guys who weren't playing Game 5. So Orr wasn't playing. Savard wasn't playing. He was hurt a bit. Dryden wasn't playing because they alternated goalkeepers. So that's where they were when they weren't on the ice. So questions? How much time do we got? Okay, a few minute questions.
Gary, you mentioned at the outset that when the agreement was signed, it was with the CAHA. Alan Eagleson wasn't involved. Obviously, he had to get involved as the head of the PA. How was it that, at the risk of taking up the rest of the weekend, how was it that he was able to sort of get in there and play such a dominant role, where it looked like he was, in charge of everything?
Well, because he had access to the players, that was his trump card. He can say you can have all the agreements you want, but without any players, there's no series. So he, through the NHL Players Association, that was his trump card. And Hockey Canada said, okay, Al, you can choose the players and you can choose the coach. And so Al was involved in choosing Harry and John, and the three of them then decided on players. And a number of the players chosen just happened to be players who Al was the agent for. And the rights to the series on television, Al set up a company with Harold Ballard and Ballard Orr, it was called. I mean, Bobby didn't really know anything about it. And that was used sort of as a dummy company to then go out and get advertising. And they paid CTV, I think, $1 million to do the broadcasting. Enormous amount of money was made in this series. The guys who did the advertising said it was equivalent to the Super Bowl, first Super Bowl. The difference between Saturday Night Hockey Night in Canada and this series was sort of a factor of 10. And you may notice that if you're all observant here, there are no ads on the boards in Canada, no ads. But in Moscow, full of ads. And that was because Bunny Ahern controlled the ad business. And he and Eagleson couldn't agree on ads in Canada. And the Soviets were only happy to get, what they called hard currency at the time. So that's why Canadian companies were on the boards in Moscow. There was nothing in Canada. And I think that we didn't really get ads on the boards in Canada until the late 70s.
Gary, I guess two questions. First of all, I guess your background, maybe professionally, that led you to this tournament, or how you got involved in this tournament, or why you were chosen to go to this tournament. I was curious about that first. Secondly, I was curious, we all know about Cheevers and Sanderson and Bobby Hull and JC Tremblay, but there was other players that were invited to this event. I think Walt Tkachuk, for one, from the New York Rangers. I think Dallas Smith, maybe from the Bruins. I think Tkachuk had a hockey school or something, and I think that might have been led to how maybe even Henderson got there. Can you tell us maybe, I guess first of all, like I said, what brought you to this and why you were chosen to go and what your professional background was, and secondly, maybe some of those players that opted not to go. And, I would love to hear, I guess, their stories, if anyone ever has them, or what you can speak to the guys that decided not to go and maybe the regret they felt after.
Yeah, so I graduated in political science, 1968. I wrote the exams for the Foreign Service. I passed the exams, went to an interview. They said, okay, Gary, where have you traveled in the world? I'd gone by bus to Washington once, but I had worked at Expo 67 as a host at the Ontario Pavilion. And I said, I haven't traveled the world, but the world came to Canada and I was there. And that answer got me through the oral exam. So I get to Ottawa in May 68, just before Trudeau is elected. And they put me on the Soviet desk right away. So I was dealing with Czechoslovakian invasion. And I was to analyze whether there was going to be an invasion or not, and came to the conclusion that there were three options: yes, no, and maybe. And our ambassador left Prague at the time in the summer, August the 20th. And we had a big meeting in the East Bloc with Mitchell Sharp, and we were deciding, what are we going to do about this invasion? Are they, crossing into West Germany, where we had all our troops and Air Force? And I was a junior guy supposed to take notes. And Saturday, they all looked around and said, we want coffee. We're probably going to have sandwiches, but the cafeteria is closed. Who's going to go and get the sandwiches and the coffee? The youngest guy in the room. So instead of dealing with War and Peace, I was dealing with Mayo or mustard. Yeah. Mayo or mustard. So they must have thought I had done all right. Decided that I was going to go to Moscow. But before I went, I was sent to a special school for a year of Russian language training. So every day, 10 hours a day, every week, every month for a year. And my wife said, you're not going there to Moscow learning Russian without me having any knowledge of the language. So she took a leave from her teaching job, and there were just the two of us and the teacher. And it was your turn, your turn, your turn, your turn, your turn, your turn. No chance to sleep or look out the window or anything like that. So by the time we got to Moscow, I was pretty good. Read, write, talk, of course. And as I mentioned, I was in charge of exchanges and I played hockey. So the hockey file was on my desk. And the ambassador, of course, was involved, but it landed as one of my jobs. So I'm 26 years old. Pretty got an idea of the lay of the land. I got to know the Russians. We played every Saturday outdoors against them. I know something about diplomacy at that point. And that's why I got involved in the negotiations. And then that's why the Canadian side said, okay, you're the one that's going to be the escort officer. So that's how I became involved in this. And then I had I'm a career diplomat and a former ambassador, served in a lot of trouble spots, wars, terrorism, Berlin Wall coming down, evacuation of Canadians and so on. And became an author later and film co-producer at the same time. Now, yeah, Walt Kachuk, he runs a golf course not too far from here. What's it called, Hal?
River Valley.
River Valley, yeah. So yeah, he had other commitments. These calls were fairly late because a lot of guys did have camps. And so they said, no, I'm too busy. I don't think they realized the importance of this series. And then who else have you got? 35 players. Well, am I going to crack this team? And don't forget, Al added 3 other guys, 3 of his newly signed clients to bring the total up to 38, Van Boxmeer and so on. So the argument there was we needed 2 full teams, 19 and 19, to have NHL conditions for the training because there were no other teams playing in the August of 72. So I imagine there are a lot of guys who are sorry that they didn't join the team. The guys that bailed out on the team, Vic Hatfield being one, Gilbert Perreault, Rick Martin, Jocelyn Gouvernement. I don't think they were particularly happy that they left. Whether you play or not, you're part of the team. And, that was my point of view. You're with the team, and Al Eagleson made that clear in Sweden. You're either in the boat or you're out of the boat. And if you're out of the boat, goodbye. So Vic thought that there'd be a real exodus. And the argument was, we've got to get back and get in shape in our own training camps. And we're just, we're not playing games here. So yeah, you'd have to go around and survey all those players that were called and see what they feel like, why they didn't join. Yep.
Yeah, so, how did you? Yeah, I know, that's why I'm trying to speak up a little bit. So, how did you prepare, or how were the players prepared for their trip to Moscow? And given what rules to play by or to behave when they were there? For example, did you set them up to experience all the bugging in their hotel rooms?
Yes. So in Winnipeg, Al organized for me to come and talk to the players about what to expect in Moscow. The in-tourist hotel, I used to call it the Viper's Nest because there were drug dealers, prostitutes of all kinds, men and women, boys and girls. It was a troubled spot. And it's hard to convince people that this is serious business. And one way that we thought we'd get around it was bringing the wives and girlfriends with the team, right? Soviets never had anybody with them when they went to Canada. and they were afraid of defections. They had a lot of minders with them. And don't forget that the way the Soviets control people is they have hostages back home, right? You bail out, you make a run for Niagara Falls or whatever, your mom, your dad, your sister are toast. Or you lose all your privileges, because when you're a hockey player or a ballerina, you get a car, you get an apartment, you get access to special foods. Nobody else had that. And so you don't want to give that up, and you keep your nose clean. And I could tell on the plane who some of the minders were. And, Trachak was a member of the Young Communist League. He was one of the people that tried to keep the other players in check. Petrov also. So Team Canada, hard for them to believe that this goes on. Then we had the issue of, whether there was a bugging device or not. And there's a famous story of Frank Mahovlich and Phil Esposito going into a room and seeing a bump on the floor. Have you heard that story?
No.
So they say, oh, bug, okay, bug, and lift up the carpet, and there's a bulge, and Frank starts unscrewing it, and then boom, the big chandelier below falls, crashes to the ground. And they denied that happened, but a colleague of mine who was there said he saw a chandelier being carted away. Were steaks being pilfered? Yeah, some of the steaks were pilfered, not by the KGB and so on, but pilfering, as I mentioned, things were in rough shape in the Soviet Union. They had fought a devastating war against the Germans, and the place was in shambles, and 25 million people killed, and there were a lot of older women sweeping streets, no men around to do the job. So you get a big fat steak from Canada Packers. 300 steaks were sent over, beef steaks like this, and we ended up cutting them in half. And beer, that was the thing. Okay, Gary, we might bring a chef over, but one thing we need, I think it was 75 cases of beer. So there again, guys are drinking beer during the series, and some of the beer was pilfered, but I wasn't worried about that because the embassy had a lot of beer we would import through duty free. Yeah.
And when's next?
After game 8, did you have an opportunity to interact with the Russian players either shortly after or even over time, and get their feelings and their views as to what had happened during this tournament and how it affected them?
Yeah, well, I was there. I mentioned about following the Soviet press and talking to the players, and I went back for the 45th anniversary, and then was back in Moscow in September of 2021 when we were doing the filming for Icebreaker. And, Trachak rose up through the ranks and head of the Russian Ice Hockey Federation. And a lot of the Russian players said, we never lost an international game when we were up 5-3 going into the third period. The Canadians made, and this is his Trachak's, Canadians made magic. And then they used the line that, well, we didn't lose. Hockey was the winner. And that became a standard line from them. There were no winners or losers in this exhibition series. It was the game of hockey that won. And I hear that all the time. And when I was at the filming there, it was just before the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. There's a museum, ice hockey museum in Moscow. And I was with one of the Russian players. It's an ice museum. But there's a uniform, number 11 in the Hall of Fame. And so number 11, yeah, I know who wears that. Guy called Putin. And one of the players just looked at me and said, Putin, 5'7". Stapleton was 5'7". And we used to joke, you guys see eye to eye, and sometimes Putin would wear platform shoes, but he said that that was one of the seminal events in his youth, growing up as a teenager, seeing the Canada-Soviet hockey series. And the Tupolev 134, I think it was, the supersonic passenger jet, the equivalent of the Concorde. Those were two seminal things for him. The Russian hockey anthem, cowards don't play hockey. Right? So Putin likes to show that he's a tough guy and take his shirt off and get on a horse, go through a cold river. Pictures of him with shades on in a naval uniform or an Air Force uniform. Mr. Tough Guy. So he wants to be associated with other tough guys. And those tough guys are hockey players. So twice he's had the Team Canada over, and we did have a slide here of Putin surrounded by the Canadian players and the Soviet players. But when I was there in 2017 with the Movavi brothers, amazing. You know, they go into a department store and a guy said, well, I remember you. You don't have to pay for anything. That series captivated everybody in the Soviet Union, just like it did here. And, you know, the Canadians we were depicted as, there's a film called Legenda numero 17. It's legend number 17 about Harlamov. And in it, Canadians are pictured as bulls. Harlamov's mother was Spanish. And so they played on the theme that we were wild bulls with horns and so on. And they remember this very, very clearly to this very day. And that's why I say that hockey still is a bridge, a tentative bridge these days, but still a bridge between us and them, because it's our sport, and it's I'd say it's their number one sport, maybe with soccer close second.
Yeah, last question is going to Dennis, way past our deadline.
More than 50 years later, the Russians are involved in a war in Ukraine. They are forbidden to participate in Olympics and World Championships. And yet we have all kinds of Canadian and American players earning their living playing in the KHL. Not only that, Putin has offered Russian passports to certain Canadian and American players. The reason for that is that they're playing with KHL teams, and if they have a Russian passport, they do not count as imports on their teams. Further to that, if they stay in Russia for 3 years, they technically will be eligible to play for Russia if the ban by the IIHF is lifted. I just want to get your opinion about the morality of all this.
Well, there isn't any morality in it. It's just politics, right? And practicality, and hockey players not wanting to think about those types of issues. They want a contract, don't have a contract in Canada. We just saw one of the London Five sign on in the KHL. We've had Canadian coaches over there for, a number of years. So there's back and forth. And let's not forget that between, 55 and 60 Russian players are in the NHL. And some of them are the very best players in the NHL. And is Gary Bettman going to shut them down? No, because it's all about money. And it's all about money over there as well. And the Olympics is all about money. It costs, billions, I think $2-3 billion to stage the Olympics. You need financing. People need money to do this, that, and the other thing. And with money comes strings. You've got to do this in order to get this money. So am I surprised by what you said? I didn't know that they were offering them passports, but not surprising. Any morality in it? No.
Okay, that note, thanks a lot, gentlemen.